Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a great show ahead, obviously, recapping last night's big games. Pretty valiant effort by Seattle, my team, against the Detroit Lions, going into Detroit down a couple of defensive players, but alas, to no avail. But the less we say about the Titans-Dolphins game, the better. But we do have to mention that game, unfortunately, as much as it kind of pains me to mention it because there weren't many big fantasy performances. But then we get into the fun stuff of the week. Start my positional rankings with the QBs and running backs. Take a look around the waiver wire. A lot of interesting players still out there on the open market. And then conclude with my bold fantasy predictions for this coming week. My Don't Be Surprised If segment, if you will, to conclude. Before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you do feel so inclined. Also, you guys have been doing a great job of this already, but I'm going to continue to hammer it home. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to interact with the show. Get your comments on air, any burning questions, comments, or concerns about fantasy sports, whether it be trade analyses, whether it be team analyses. I love every single comment that comes through this show. So if you feel so inclined throughout the entirety of the show, consider making yourselves available to these three great features. Without further ado, let's jump right in today's show. Let's start off with a fantasy recap. Let's start off with the weaker of the two games just to get it out of the way. Before we get into it, all I really can say about this game is that it was one of those games where you really had to kind of choke it up and watch, even though you didn't feel like it, right? It was one of those games where, hey, it's a doubleheader. I can tune into the Seattle game later if this game's bad. And that's what it turned out being, right? You know, you kind of checked out of this game midway through it. Maybe even after Will Levis got injured in, the third play of the game you checked out. But there really isn't much to say outside of the fact that perhaps Mason Rudolph can lead this Titans offense more competently. And for the life of me, I don't know why Mike McDaniel did not utilize Tyler Huntley to the best of his abilities. That's something I said yesterday in my prior episode when I talked about a guy like Tyler Huntley. If he's a dual-threat quarterback, you can open up a lot of avenues in the run game, try and work the short to intermediate areas of the field in the pass game, and try and play mistake-free football, most importantly. But they looked like a college-level, FCS-level offense out there. It did not look pretty for that offense. And it's not going to look pretty if they continue to put their quarterbacks in disadvantageous situations. And so that is kind of telling to me that it might not just be the quarterback situation. It could very well be Mike McDaniel's coaching that's holding this team back. Because now, yes, it sucks that Tua's out, and we know how much you love him and his big playability in the passing game. But you have Tyler Huntley, who's someone who adds a lot of value with his legs, which is something that Tua doesn't bring. So why not bring it in to your offense if Tyler Huntley's the guy going forward? But in terms of fantasy, if there's anything to take away from this game, it's the Titans' run game. Obviously, with Will Levis out there, we're going to lean very heavily on the run game, and it's stepped up, in my honest opinion. Tony Pollard is probably the only fantasy star of the game. 22 carries, 88 yards, 1 touchdown for him, 18.8 fantasy points. And then, make of this what you will, the Titans' defense had a decent game, but of course, the Dolphins' offense was so sloppy that it might not even have mattered. 12 fantasy points, 1 fumble recovery, and 2 sacks in this game for them. So, as you can see, very, very sloppy game overall, but ultimately, one team had to win it, and the Titans had a more convincing run game, surprisingly. Even though, it kind of came about, unfortunately. We do hope for Will Levis' speedy recovery, even though, he may not be the best of quarterbacks. Perhaps, Brian Callahan still thinks something of him and wants to continue to use him as their number one choice. But Mason Rudolph, at the very least, played a very competent part in this game as the QB in last night's game for them. And on the Dolphins side of things, they really blew it. They really blew it, man. I don't know how, if you're a Dolphins fan, you can continue watching this team knowing that Mike McDaniel is probably ruining Tua's absence more than trying to figure out ways to implement exciting elements to this offense with what he has. Because he still has a lot, and I guess I get that you're kind of struggling trying to create big plays, but it's what you have at your quarterback position that could be very exciting if you utilize the best parts of him. So going forward, that's what I want to see out of the Dolphins if they have any consistency. But let's get on to the more exciting game. And yes, as a Seattle fan, the more, disappointing result, at least for me. Although, as a Seattle fan, I couldn't be prouder of a loss in recent Seattle Seahawks history than this one. Because you go into Detroit, going up against an NFC Championship game participant from last year, this close to making the Super Bowl. Down 4 of perhaps your best defenders, you lose Julian Love in the midst of the game, and you still hang tough with a Detroit Lions offense that looked like nobody could stop it. This was the get-right game, as Tap to Learn says, feel bad for Tariq. Wouldn't be surprised if they trade him for a slew of picks. I mean, the trade interest would be surprising, because he still adds a lot of value to this team. But, you're right in thinking that perhaps the Tua situation will look a bit more shaky as the year goes forward, because we don't know how he'll look when he gets back, when his timeline to return is back, and most importantly, what his family is thinking if, they are considering his early retirement this season. So I feel like Tyreek is one of those players who you have to find ways to utilize. And yes, there were a lot of plays in which he was going on end arounds in last night's game. They tried to get him going in the run game, but you just have to find a way to work him into this offense if you're Mike McDaniel with what you have at the QB position. You can't make excuses for, we lost the big play, woe is me. Tyreek Hill still has speed. He still has effective route running skills in the middle of the field where Tyler Huntley might be more comfortable passing the football. And, most importantly, he can open up a lot of avenues for the supplementary pieces of this offense. So he is an interesting player when it comes to who to consider leaving at the trade-in line. But at the very end of the day, he still could add a lot of value if Mike McDaniel just sees the best in him throughout the rest of the season and not ruining what Tua could have brought, rather than a guy like Tyler Huntley. But let's get to the Seattle-Detroit game, because that is the more exciting of the two. Let's talk about Detroit. This was the get-right game that they needed, albeit, as Tapton said, he might ask for a trade himself. Well, he might not be as, antsy as Stephon Diggs to leave, Buffalo and go to Houston, but he could ask for it if this is what the Dolphins' offense is going to be for the rest of the year. And that's a disappointing thing because a lot of fantasy owners had high hopes for him this year, but it is what it is. You can't necessarily control when or how Tua gets injured. So I feel bad for the Dolphins, but at the same time, I don't feel bad right now for Mike McDaniel and the place he's put this offense in. But we have to get to the Seattle-Detroit game because both of these teams prove something. For Detroit, it proved how dynamic this offense truly is. Every single facet of this game for them on the offensive side of the football, whether it be the run game, whether it be Amon-Ra through the air, both passing and receiving the ball, so to speak. And Jared Goff, 18 of 18. Perfect game from Jared Goff. 292 yards, 2 TDs, 1 receiving TD through the air, 27.18 fantasy points for him. Sterling performance from him at home in a must-win, kind of a must-win situation for Detroit. It kind of cements them as still one of the premier teams in the NFC. But if you're Seattle, this game proved more about them than it did about Detroit. Because a lot of people thought Seattle could not hang with Detroit. Yes, they were mentioning the defensive struggles. But on offense, they didn't seem to think that this Seattle team would hold up against a very potent run defense and potentially kind of sneaky secondary. But they more than held their own. Let's talk about Geno Smith. Career day for him in terms of pass completions, pass attempts, like I said, and passing yards. 38 of 56, 395 yards, 1 TD, 1 desperation interception, 21.6 fantasy points. Really impressive performance. This one is going to leave him with his head held high because he took Detroit's interior and edge rushers best shots all game, and he delivered one of the better quarterbacking performances of the season, in my opinion, in a losing effort. And he really showed that in the midst of all the offensive struggles, because I think Seattle might have the weakest offensive line of any team in the league, and that's saying something, but I feel like Gino's showing us that he can still be a premier quarterback for this team, and in Ryan Grubb's offense, the sky's the limit for him. If he just takes care of the football, keeps Seattle in games, they can continue to surprise these bigger teams. They're going to face a lot more explosive attacks, and they're going to might have to play catch-up. As Will Casper, welcome to you in the chat. Trade Mike Evans for Kelsey. I have great wide receiver depth and a Pitts at tight end. I feel like keeping Mike Evans here would be the best situation, because as Kelsey might get more targets in that Chiefs offense, I still feel like the best QB wide receiver duo in the league right now might just be Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans. They're hitting their stride this season, and they're both been paragons of consistency to start the year. And it just goes to show the development of this Bucs offense, even without Dave Canales to control it. And I think that it would be a terrible mistake to try and feel it out with Kelsey, because Kelsey's the older player, and yes, he perhaps is looking like the most appealing weapon in that Chiefs attack right now, but Mike Evans is just a huge, valuable asset for you. And it just proves that if you're saying you have great wide receiver depth, why, risk losing one of your best ones for someone who might not provide as much going forward. So I would say stay put there, have good depth. I trust your intuition, and good luck to you in your fantasy football exploits. But I do want to round this out, because one of the surprising kind of through lines and storylines of this game was the Seattle Seahawks O-line, and most importantly, how it affected the run game. Because the Lions were the most, as Will Casper says, thanks man, appreciate it. I appreciate you, Will. Continue to comment throughout the show if you so feel like it. The most impressive aspect of this game for Seattle, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, was the Seattle O-line. Yes, Aiden Hutchinson affected the game a little bit, but he did not record a sack, and his name wasn't called that much. And Stone Forsythe, who is a backup tackle, really held his own. I was really impressed by him. Kudos to him. The ground game is what really surprised me. Kenneth Walker especially surprised me. A hat trick of touchdowns on 80 yards and 12 carries, 33.8 fantasy points. Off an oblique injury, he came back with a vengeance. He really showed how valuable he can be for the Seattle offense. It shows how varied, most importantly, Seattle can be, because DK Metcalf also had a huge game. 7 catches, 104 yards, 15.4 fantasy points. But just supplementary, complementary football is what's going to get this Seattle team to be one of the feistier ones in the NFC. And I think they proved it tonight last night in a valiant effort against the Detroit Lions team that really took advantage of them. This game could have been closer too. Obviously, the DK Metcalf fumble early in the first is a painful one. The potentially missed pass interference call that should have been overturned, the 2-point conversion. I can make all the excuses for Seattle. But even in a loss, I can't look past the fact that they still made a valiant go at it on the road against one of the NFC's best. And for that, as a Seattle fan, I'm forever grateful. They played a fantastic game. I could not have asked more of that offense. And I can't really blame the defense, even though Mike McDonald was trying to piece together a defensive unit that was sound enough to try and attempt to stop this Lions offense. So we have to roll with the punches. We go again next week against New York. But it is a very fascinating game. It was a very fascinating game if you're a fantasy football manager or just a fan of the NFL. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. But coming up next, we're going to be taking a brief look around the league in terms of the waiver wire. It's a huge, huge week for a lot of big players in terms of the open market. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. 'Cause every